We've got this Bogner Shiva that just came in. Blowing fuses, please diagnose. Okay, let's get started. All right, let's see which fuse blew. Notice a little bit of Sharpie there, marking out a 2. They do that so in the US they can have a 3 amp indication, and in Europe and other places with 240 volts, they have a 2 amp designation. Had one where that Sharpie got erased or something, and it said 32 amps, so someone put in a 30 amp fuse, the closest they could find, and no surprise, the amp went up in smoke. So let's see if this is indeed a 3 amp fuse, and if it's blown. It's a 3 amp fuse. This one has not blown. So let's check the HT fuse. HT fuse blowings usually indicate a much less expensive problem than mains fuse blowings, though not always. Yeah, it's the HT fuse is blown. Please let it be a 1/2 watt fuse that blew in here. Nope. All right, see, I have no guarantee what I'm going to find in here, because instead of using a 1/2 amp fuse, 500 milliamp, they used a 2 amp fuse, and it still blew. So if something was wrong enough in the circuit, probably a power tube or something, in the output, that the HT fuse blew at half an amp, don't put in a 2 amp. That just means that something else will burn before the 2 amp fuse blows. Let's see how bad it is. Well, initially, it looks like this owner has gotten lucky despite using the 2 amp HT fuse. I don't see anything that's burned. I don't smell anything that's burned. It had a pair of JJ branded EL34s, EL34Ls in. They look okay. They don't rattle. There's no discoloration. There's no smell at the pins. But they are going to be the most likely cause of a short. So I'm going to power the amp on without those output tubes in place and see if the fuse blows or not. Now, normally, I would first measure the B plus paths to ground at various points, but my meter leads died 2 days ago. I think I just ran over one with my chair one too many times. I've got some new fluke meter leads supposed to arrive any minute. So this is a temporary setback. If it works without the tubes, then I know it's just going to be tubes most likely. If it doesn't work without the tubes, it's something else. Either way, I'm going to have to get those meter leads to finish because I'll have to check the bias on new tubes and stuff. But let's bring it into standby. I'm watching my current limiter. These bits I'll speed up on the playback, but 30-second chunks will be taken out just so you don't have to sit here and watch nothing. All right, I'm going to take it out of standby into play, no output tubes, and I'm watching the current limiter. No current being drawn. That's pretty good. Power it off. At this point, I will put in a test pair of EL34s, and I'll be watching my current limiter as I power these on. So now, with no tubes in place, with the test tubes in place, put in standby, and let me hook up a speaker jack. Now that I've got tubes going on, I hate the impedance selector on Bogners, at least the Shivas. It's very fragile, likes to break. It's replaceable, but shouldn't be necessary on an amp in this price range to very often replace the impedance selector switch. My cab is a little too far for the cable to reach. Let me move some things. All right, that took longer than it should have. Let's take it out of standby. I'm watching my current meter. Pretty good glow on that bulb, but it's not bright. It's not like a failing thing. Yeah, that tube's microphonic. That's why it's in my test stash. So I'm gonna let this sit for a little bit and see if it develops any problems as it gets hot. Then I'm gonna play through it, and I imagine that the owner got very lucky. He just needs a new pair of EL34s, and I'll make sure it's biased correctly. Shivas are tricky to bias. So tricky, in fact, that I'm not even gonna tell you how to do it. You really need to be a pretty experienced tech to understand what Bogner is recommending and why. If you have a Shiva, you're buying into a certain set of obligations. You're saying that I can afford to take my amp to a tech, and you really should. Well, I spoke to the owner while I was letting the thing warm up, and in the meantime, my new fluke leads for my meter arrived, so I can meter things again, which is I was feeling a little bit nervous and apprehensive. Oh, Ma, I'm nervous and my socks are too loose. But got it all good other than these test EL34s are microphonic. So I've got some TAD red bases on order. The owner is aware of everything. He says he bought the amp used, had these tubes, had these fuses. He never changed a thing. He and his buddy were cranking it. It sounded great for a few hours. Then it blew the fuse. It's just time. The JJs are fine tubes, but they all have a finite lifespan. This thing's been on for about an hour, the last 30 minutes of it without the current limiter, and it seems to be working just fine. So the owner got very lucky, all things considered. Here's a little preview of what the channels sound like. Then the boosted clean. And then the boosted dirt. So the amp sounds very healthy, and I'll give it a proper playing test with a real mic once the new tubes arrive. I do want to point out something about this Shiva though. This right here is a little third-party power supply made by CUI, and it provides the 12 volts DC that the switching stuff in the amp uses and that the preamp heater supply uses. It's a third-party one, as I said, made by CUI. It's rated for 65 watts, and it is no longer made. Bogner does not have them. Bogner cannot get them. 2 of them died, and 2 other Shivas, and I'm still trying to find this part. I need to renew my searches for it. But Bogner said that the new 75 watt version of the same board would work if you change a certain cap. I tried that. It did not on either. With the new supply, the one that CUI is currently making, there's a very objectionable high-pitched whine, and it is caused by a change in their circuit. And Bogner does not have a good replacement for this. Now, I'm not a big fan of designing an amp to have a switching power supply. This is called a switch mode power supply. It makes it small and cheap, and in theory replaceable until that part's no longer made. This could have been a secondary transformer and another little board with some components to take and make a good regulated clean 12 volt supply, but they didn't do that. They went very cost effective, which is great until this part no longer exists. And this part really doesn't seem to exist anymore. They do pop up used from time to time. Like I said, I got to renew my search for it. But this is the Achilles heel of every Bogner Shiva out there. Well, actually, no, the early ones didn't use that. Pretty much the majority of Shivas do. This is what you see when you open them up. Some of the early ones do not. So I can't do a blanket statement, but something to watch out for.